All Things Alice. This podcast will explore the cultural phenomenon of Alice in Wonderland as artistic landmark and global symbol of inspiration and imagination. I'm your host, Frank Beddor, the author of the Looking Glass Wars trilogy. Let's explore, what is it about Alice? Welcome back to the show, everybody. Today is part 2 of my interview with Ken Friedman. Why is it part 2? Because he has a lot of really good stories about Hollywood, movie stars, movies he's worked on, and I want to get into the nuts and bolts of writing television, writing film, creating story, and how all of us can be more creative, more authentic, and fully realize our voice when it comes to creating. Okay? So, Kenny, part 2. Let's do it. So, we left off talking about your movie, The Fugitive, and the work on The Fugitive you did. By the way, I watched it again with Teresa, my new wife. And thanks for coming to the wedding. And it's such a terrific movie. I mean, it is the perfect Hollywood blockbuster in terms of setting up a character that's smart and compelling with a antagonist in Tommy Lee Jones that's just as compelling, charismatic. And so you have these two characters that both are highly skilled, really dueling it out. And I found the movie, even, 20 years later, 25 years later, to be fantastic. So congrats on that. But I wanted to jump into Cadillac Man. Tell me about that movie, working with Robin Williams, and Roger directed it.
Yeah, that was a great experience.
Yeah?
I had, it was after I had directed, we talked about Made in USA.
Mm-hmm.
Having completed that picture, I bought myself a little present, which I needed because of the difficulties of completing the film and the fights with John Daly over the cut. I was
What did you buy yourself?
hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. I needed a break, so we went to Hong Kong. I went with Jim Newport, production designer, on Made in USA and White Line Fever and Heart Like a Wheel, and one of my best friends. And we went to Hong Kong and had a great time. And while I was there, I noticed that every man of means in Hong Kong had a family with children who lived up on top of the big mountain overlooking Hong Kong, and some 3,000 square foot condominium with a great view, the two kids and the nanny. And then he had a mistress who was maybe 10, 15 years younger than him, an accomplished woman who wasn't interested in marriage, just somebody you could take on business meetings, and of course have sex with too. That was kind of your respectful partner. And then they had a new girlfriend, probably a college student, or putting up quote fingers, college student, and they went to these other restaurants. It was a whole different set of restaurants and shows and movies for Hong Kong chicory, I think they called it. With lots of mirrors and flash. And so he had his girlfriend who he was helping out and supporting. And then they still found reason to go to Bangkok on business every 3 weeks. So when I got back to L.A., I was thinking about that would be a good story, to do a story about a guy in New York who's juggling a wife, a daughter, a girlfriend, a mistress, and is overwhelmed by these various relationships and kind of in love with them all. So that was the idea I had. And off of Made in USA, I had an arrangement to develop films at Orion, which was a studio back in the early late 80s. They'd been very successful. Yeah, they did Dancing with Wolves. And then
Silence of the Lambs. All right.
So they were very good. And I was working on that idea. And there was a very good executive, story executive, Michael Barlow, who worked at Columbia at that time. And I was just not, and I said, "What's your story?" And about halfway through, he says, "Wait a minute." And he runs down the hall. He comes back with the 6'2" Australian director who had just done Cocktail, Roger Donaldson. And Roger came in, and so he had a deal to develop and direct pictures at Orion, and he was looking for a story. He was looking for a movie to develop. Michael put us together, and he said, "Roger, what film?" This is Roger Donaldson. Hi. We had the same agent. We had never met. And so we shook hands. It was great. He said, "Roger, what do you want to do?" And he said, "My father was a car salesman. I want to do a movie about a car salesman. And I want to call it Cadillac Man."
Okay.
And I said, "Okay, here's the story."
And
I pitched the story about the guy juggling, and without knowing, actually, Roger's early films in New Zealand, where he developed his career, were all about cheating husbands and cheating wives. And so he immediately said, "This is great." Michael had made the deal. He said, "Okay, let's go down and tell it to Mike Medavoy being the head of Orion at the time." And we go into Mike's office. It was a great place. Doors were open. And Barlow says, "Listen to the story the guys had." And we got about 10 minutes through the pitch about the girlfriends. And he said, "Who's your agent?" I said, "Harry Eflin." No, it was Jeff Sanford at the time. And he said, "Okay, I'll call your agent." And so we want to do this. We'll develop the deal. We'll figure out the money later. We'll send Ken a check for $10,000 and get him started, work out the details. I said, "You okay with me?" I said, "It's okay with me." When I tell the story, it was not a comedy. Roger didn't do comedy, and I certainly had no reputation for doing comedy. Though if something was funny, it was good. Laughter is good even in a dark film. So we told the story. We began working on the story. Roger went off to direct the movie that he was directing with Orion, and so I had about 3 months window to write the script, and I was working with Barlow. And my initial thought is that they had a deal with Al Pacino, and they said Cadillac Man, New York, Al Pacino. That was all part of the package that Orion was dealing with. So you didn't think Al and think comedy, and so we thought we'd do a twist on when it came to the story we were going to tell. Now we had the character, and we kind of had the theme, and we had a director, and we thought what might be good is, he had just done Dog Day Afternoon, and where he was the hostage taker in a hostage situation. And we said, why don't we do the reverse and have him be the hostage taken?
Mm-hmm.
And we were thinking that, Cadillac Man, luxury item, symbol of capitalistic America. What if there was an armory near a car dealership, and these radicals from the '60s stole some guns? The cops chased them. They took refuge in the dealership, and then you'd have a love story dialectic with the capitalist car salesman with the radical.
Is that what you had pitched, or this was coming out of?
All I had pitched was the fact that somebody
had all these
relationships.
Okay.
But we didn't have a story.
Right.
So, so on top of all the relationships that the car dealer was dealing with, he now had to develop a relationship with a woman that was completely different than all the other women in his life.
Right.
And in a hostage situation. But it was difficult to write. And I was sitting with Barlow one day, and we were talking about the same conversation we're having now. We're talking story, which is really what we do. And I think I said, what would be funny? All these women that he's sleeping with, and there's one woman in the car dealership that he can't get, and her husband is the one who breaks into the dealership because he thinks it's what's going to catch his wife cheating on him. And forget the politics and forget all of that. So, we came up with a different situation, and I began writing it, and it just made sense. The idea with the character wrote itself, and it was about selling. It's a movie about selling. And, that's what we do as filmmakers. We sell. We sell like shit. We sell like hell. We go in there, we pitch, we try to sell our ideas, convince people that our ideas for the movie are right, and hope they get on the same boat with us. So, same boat as the creators.
When you talk to your students at NYU, do you talk to them about? Do you mention that whole idea if it starts to write itself? If you know that you're onto something, or if you're stuck, maybe you're not in the right story.
Yeah, I mean, you need to be flexible, and there's exploration.
Mm-hmm.
It's just part of writing. You go down a lot of dead ends. I'm sure I write 200-300 pages for a 100-page script. You try stuff. You get out of your head and onto the paper.
But what do you say to students who need to go pitch? I mean, you had a little bit of obviously a track record. You had Roger interested. You had a broad kind of conceptual idea that was easy to understand, but you really didn't have the story. So when you go in to pitch something to a studio executive, is the difference back then that you can go in with something that loose and find it, and these days you have to come in with it fully realized? Or
This was, we're in the midst of a writer's strike now, and we can talk about that as well. There were periodic writer's strikes. The nature of the business changes. And, I was very fortunate to live and work here in the 80s and 90s, and 70s too, when the studios, the people who finance movies, were very interested in having the creators, the actors, producer, director, come to them with projects. They were in the business of developing ideas into stories, and certainly in the 80s, the studios had big staffs of production executives,
development executives.
And production too.
Yeah.
Cause
The whole thing.
Talk about the costs. They have an apparatus, and they developed 5 or 10 movies for every one they made. It kept a lot of writers employed, encouraged to come up with their own original ideas, which they would get the studios to do. And if it didn't happen, the scripts might bounce back to another producer. But there were like hundreds of scripts just all over town. And the business was set up to get many writers to develop their abilities and develop their stories. Sometimes they get made, sometimes they didn't. I estimate I've written 80 screenplays and teleplays.
Wow.
And had 20 made.
But the difference is you're saying taking an idea and finding the story. These days, not only do you have to come in with the story, you have to come in with the whole script sometimes, and the package, and a piece of financing, and an actor. So it's very difficult. And if right away, if they don't like the idea, they don't want to read the story or the script, and they don't want to develop it. So is that the distinction that
I was a contract writer, and of those 80 films scripts that I wrote or wrote on, not
right,
or rewrote, and I said 20 got made. I was only not paid on one.
Got it.
I was a contract writer. I was helping. For me, it was a lot of fun, to say, okay, this movie is going to be one that for an actor or producer, I think, helping Chuck, helping Jonathan, helping Roger, Walter, work on scripts. Sometimes I worked on scripts for studios, and often in collaboration with other, including with producers and directors. So the way that we worked on the films that we talked about was very collaborative. And the studio system in the 80s and the 90s, relied upon the filmmakers to come up with the ideas for movies and package. The studios would kind of package stuff together. But now you have many ideas and movies that are driven by the studios, driven by all the Marvel world, the DC world.
Pre-existing IP.
Yeah.
But the same idea, there's still collaboration. There's still, looking to develop, if, especially if it's within their DC or Marvel universe, it's just you don't have the middle ground, the diversity of interesting ideas that, like Cadillac Man, that are just, hey, this is kind of a cool idea. Let's see where this idea leads us.
Yeah, and ultimately, and to finish the story, I was talking with him about. So we came up with this other idea about the hostage taker being a jealous, cuckolded husband, and I walked down the road, the offices in Ryan, and past Mike Medavoy, and he says, "How's that picture coming along? How's the writing good?" And I said, "Good, but it's funny." And he said, "Funny is good. Go finish it." And
So you sold it. You sold it as a drama, and when you
character piece,
but given the politics you were talking about, it's closer to a
serious
drama.
film. Yeah,
Serious film. And you're talking about Pacino.
By the way, I think Pacino could have done it well as well. Would have been a different movie, but it still would have been funny without.
Yeah.
But Robin, good guy.
And what did he bring to? Obviously, he's hugely talented. But did he improvise a lot of dialogue? Was he collaborative on the set? Did Roger, encourage him or try and rein him in?
It was a great situation. I was on the set all the time. Robin, early on, came to me and said, the reason I'm doing this film is because I love the script. The script's it's a great read. If I gave you the script now to read, you'd say, let's make this. In certain ways, it's better than the movie. But of course, who wouldn't want Robin to do his stuff? He's funny, he's insightful, he comes up with stuff. But he was smart enough to say, I don't want to mess up with the story. I don't want to change the story and change the character. We agreed we'd get a take on whatever scene we were shooting as it was written in the script. It might take 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
But we'd always get a take of the way and then open it up.
Okay.
Tim Robbins also was, well-known actor, able to improvise. Sure. So the two of them were really great together. But that was kind of the rule. Get one as it was in the script and then go to town and see what you come up with. But even more than that, we had table reads of the script in the weeks just before shooting, and therefore there was no reason to hold back. So if they tried things and improvised on the table read, which we encouraged them to do, I was sitting there and I'd make a little note. This is a good idea. That was a bad idea. And that night, go back and work for a couple of hours, update the pages. Mm-hmm. The day before, this was all digitized.
Color coded.
With color coded pages. I'd show up at 8 a.m. Mm-hmm. In rehearsals. And they'd see, that wasn't a good direction to take it in. Mm-hmm. But this has now found its way in the script. So I'd rewrite the dialogue scenes as we worked and rehearsed them to reflect when they came up with good stuff. And I think it helped them own the story. I've never been afraid to let actors improve upon my dialogue and take the credit for it.
So it sounds like a dream project. I mean, it sounds, you...
Of all the films I ever worked on, from idea, let's say for that, Roger and I agreeing to make a film about Joey O'Brien, mm-hmm. the characters that Robin played. From the moment we had that meeting, which I think was in August or September, to the first day of shooting, which was in February, was 6 months.
That's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. Nothing else. No project I've worked on before or since has been under a year, for sure. And sometimes it takes years and years, as you know. Yeah. So this one was like handshake deal. Write the script. They read the script. Roger read the script when he came back. He said, "I'm ready to do it."
Studio greenlit the movie.
We submitted it, I think, on January 15th to Orion, and Michael Barlow called me back within 3 days and said, "It's greenlit. We're making it."
Wow.
But
Yeah.
we want to go with Robin first, and we said, "Well, of course." So
That's a dream
and he
project.
came back within a couple of days and said, that he would do it, and we're off and running.
That's extraordinary because that just doesn't happen anymore. Movies coming together that quickly. What?
No, not before, not since.
No. Well, on Something About Mary, it came together within 6 months after the Farrelly brothers did their pass and
After it was written.
after it was written.
Yeah, no, this
But yours was before it was written.
Yeah.
So
No, I mean, even White Line Fever, which was fast, I think was probably a year.
So it was fast on that side. You had a good relationship with Roger. You were on the set a lot.
Yeah, we were a bunch of friends.
Robin Williams was respectful, and it sounds great. I don't remember you having the same experience with Johnny Handsome.
Oh no,
Was that a good experience? I can't remember with Mickey Rourke.
Yeah. So, it was difficult until it happened. So
Difficult to get the movie going.
yeah, Chuck after Heart
Chuck
Like a
wrote.
Wheel, Chuck produced.
Heart Like
I
a Wheel.
wrote. Jonathan directed, but Chuck had a book called The Three Worlds or Three Faces of Johnny Handsome. And we liked the idea of the book, but not the story or the character or the style or the execution or much of anything. just the idea that this guy would do.
How often does that happen? And when the producer buys a book like that, and Chuck obviously saw something in it, and then you have to adapt it, that you throw out. It must not have been a very well-known book because lots of times if you have
He had a published writer, but no.
So you basically had
It was not literature.
carte blanche.
I've done adaptations where you really want to.
Yeah, if you're doing Lord of the Rings, you
want to, yes.
you better get it right.
You want to make it for people who've seen it.
Who have read it.
Johnny Handsome, that was never.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. So in this case, the writer of the novel was okay with you.
I don't know if he was okay. He might have been dead. So.
Okay. So you just were free to.
It wasn't a new book.
You were free to adapt, take the idea, and run with it.
Yeah, and that's what Chuck wanted to do. Chuck, I think, was in business with his brother Fred on that particular book, and they thought it was a good idea for a kind of noir film, and it was a potential for a really good character, but they had made a movie about a guy who changes his face. I think it was a Humphrey Bogart film in the 40s, and but that was like go in for a week, come out a different person. It was a fantastical, But when we made Johnny Handsome, that kind of surgery to.
Well, I don't think the audience knows what the premise.
Johnny
is.
Handsome is the lead of this book, and the movie is somebody born with deformities, kind of like the Elephant Man.
Okay.
Cleft palate and large head, a lot of a lot of physical deformities that made him really even hard to look like. And obviously no woman would be interested in him, and no segment of society would have anything to do with him, except the criminal world, where they only wanted. He was a master at coming up with bank robberies and
they wanted to
armed robberies. And so the movie starts with him involved in a robbery with 3 other people, one of whom is his only friend in the world. And the other couple, Lance Hendrickson and Ellen Barkin, amazing cast, double-cross him, shoot his best friend, leave him to be taken by the cops and make off with the loot, and double-cross him. And Johnny Handsome, then Morgan Freeman, plays the cop in the film. It says, who was in it with you? Who got away with the jewels? They killed your best friend. They nearly killed you. They're leaving you to take the blame. But the only code that he's known in his life is the code of the criminal, and he's not going to give it in. They send him to Angola. It takes place in New Orleans. They send Johnny Handsome to Angola prison, and he's there for a year, serving a 30-year armed robbery sentence because he won't give up his cohorts.
He's no
And
snitch.
even then, Ellen and don't trust that he might not rat on them in the future, so they have him killed in prison. Except he doesn't die. And he's in the prison hospital, barely survived. A doctor comes in to see Forrest Whitaker, another great,
Wow.
comes in.
Amazing cast.
It is, and he comes in and he says, well, I'm part of a program. Basically, if we do 2 years of surgeries and you learn to speak and do this all over again, we can make you look like a member of society. We believe that if you're not treated like a criminal, you may not have the need to be one.
So
And
reinvent
he
yourself.
volunteers and goes through 2 years of excruciating therapies and is cut loose to see what's going to happen to him. Is he going to get, is the revenge stronger, or is the love? Elizabeth Montgomery plays
Another great
woman
actress.
who meets him, and he starts to have a relationship with her. And so what will he do? That was the story. The first script was pretty damn good. The third script was really good. So Chuck was trying to find a director so that they could make the movie and star. And there were talks with Richard Gere and this one, that one. 3 directors, as far as I know. It went to further development with Peter Guber, with Paramount. We had deals. I forget what the British director who died young, who was really good. Nobody was going to get it made. And we finally had this director, Harold Becker. And Harold I tell the story because I don't give a shit anymore. This was just after Made in USA, after I came back from my trip with Hong Kong, and just before I started the film. It was a little bit after that.
You started Cadillac Man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Before Cadillac Man. And Harold got involved, and he had notes, which I didn't think were so hot. But, it's Chuck's movie, and I'm getting paid a little incrementally on these things. But I have an investment because we've been developing this now for 5 or 6 years.
Wow. Yeah.
With 3 or 4 different directors and producers and notes. And the script has gotten a little bit, satisfying too many people. And I got distracted, in terms of having time to work on it, with making Made in USA. And Chuck too, because he was working on it. So Harold got involved, and he had a relationship with Richard Gere, and I worked with Harold. Even flew up to Vail to have story conferences. We go to a meeting at the Imperial Palace. You remember that?
Sure.
With Gere, Chuck, me, Harold. Before Gere arrives, as Gere arrives and sits down, good guy, takes the script, Harold does, that we've been working on months on, and slides it over to Gere and says, but we can fix it.
Oh, man. That's not the first impression you want.
So anyway, Gere didn't do it. They went to Pacino, because Harold had directed Pacino, and Pacino then had his staff of writers worked on it. And
He had a staff of writers? What does that mean?
one at a time. He had writers that he worked with. Not all
I see.
named writers. And they spent, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars more. I got fired, basically. Pacino kept bringing in another writer who did this and did that. This guy, he had all these New York writers, and they'd come in and they'd take a draft and get paid some money. And everyone who went in there, and I think Chuck will even tell you this, made it worse. And, it just did not have and Chuck had an opinion too about at the end, the character was saved and takes an opportunity for a new life. So it had, even though there was a lot of death into it.
Having worked with Chuck, he usually has very strong opinions and is often the driver of
I think at this time
the story is going.
did
he protect it, or did he?
Well, I don't know. I wasn't
you
in the
weren't
meetings. all I knew is that I was gone. And then at some point, Chuck tells his story better than me, so I'm not going to tell his story. But Pacino left the project, and Harold Becker were with him. And he came back to me and he said, "Were there any elements?" And I said, "There was this one thing that one of the writers came up with that I thought was good in terms of." And he then, but Chuck is dogged. I mean,
That is true.
you know. So he finally took it to Coralco, and they had a deal with Walter Hill, and I knew Walter. So Walter read the script, and he was interested. He said he read all 7 scripts plus the 5 that Pacino had developed, and he came back and he said, "Friedman number 3." And
Wait, 7 that plus the how many?
I think 5 different drafts came out of the
12?
Pacino era
That's
on the film. And he went back to
that's discipline.
and he said and I sat and worked with Walter, and I can tell many great stories. It was one of my great professional. It was just like sitting and talking with you, except unlike us, he knew everything about movies.
Right.
And history, and had worked with these people, and had done a documentary about John Ford, and and I knew Walter, and he was a great guy and a great guy to work with, and somebody who respected writers because he was one himself, one of the great writers. And so I worked with Walter, and there was a disagreement about whether the ending should be a positive or a
Or so he should,
or a
whether
noir,
it should be the
a
revenge.
noir or a blanc.
Yeah.
And he said, no, Johnny Hanson, this is a noir, and this is what happens in noirs. And there were many discussions, but by the time we started the movie, we were all on board.
Mickey Rourke? How did that come about?
I had a very good relationship with Mickey. I don't know what brought him into the picture. He did a great job in the movie. And he and Roger, Mickey needs an enemy, and I think it was Chuck. But he worked very well with, he didn't like to say a lot of dialogue like a lot of movie stars. He didn't want dialogue, so we spent time paring the dialogue down. And considering the history of the character, he would be very kept in and close, not used to speaking and expressing himself that way. So, I think his desires to cut his dialogue were helped. He knows what he can do.
Right.
And
what his strengths are.
There's something going on inside Mickey.
No, he was remarkable, and he was one of those, filmmakers or actors that had a stretch where he was so compelling to watch. Not since maybe Brando was I so drawn into an actor.
No, we got him at his height.
Yeah.
And actually, it sounds strange, but he and I played racquetball several times a week during the production. Never talk about the movie though.
That's amazing.
How whatever internal stuff was going on in Mickey, he used it in the character. He didn't use it in his life.
Who won in racquetball, generally speaking?
Generally, I did.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, so how did he take that?
He was fine. Producers were the enemy.
Yeah.
All us
Producers
creative
were the enemies.
people.
Yeah.
We were all suffering under the yoke of the man.
So when you adapt a book that's not very well known, you can really take the ideas or a theme and go somewhere that might be interesting or different from what the intention of the book is. What's your take when you're working on something that's well established? I mentioned earlier Lord of the Rings. That's a epic book that Peter Jackson seemed to find the thread that was accepted by longtime readers, even though left out big sections. So when you take on an adaptation, What do you tell your students? What would you do
You know,
when
if
you
it's a
start?
piece of literature, I feel there are times when I feel I want to work with the author if he's available, and I want to interpret cinematically his story. I don't want to make it my story.
Or her story.
And there are things, or her story, things, an adaptation of like Heart Like a Wheel about Shirley Muldowney. It was a person who I liked and a person who I followed and a person who was still active in their career. So I felt doing a story about a person active in their career,
So a real
I
life
had a
character.
responsibility.
Well, it's a biography, though, wasn't it?
Yes,
So did
but
you?
it's an adaptation of a
Yeah.
life. It's a similar process. If the book is out and people are reading it, and I liked it, I liked the world and characters that the author established. I like to work with him. I'd say him and her, but I didn't only worked with him. Tried to interpret the book, and the people who I said it was a contract writer, so people had taken the book because they were interested in the story, character, and I wanted to interpret it cinematically, but also write it in a way that was readable.
Right.
The readability of a novel is different than the readability of a script. So sometimes it was translating, but more of the time, the book or article or life suggested something, and I always went by for myself, the greater truth. Who was this person? What was at their core? Is the greater truth. Not did this happen on August 15th. We talked about those kind of
Chronological.
biopics
Yeah.
being like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. So with Heart Like a Wheel, well, it was adapting real events in her life, but interpreting them cinematically to really try to get underneath Shirley. There was a book that I adapted that didn't get made called Garbage. It was like one of my.
Oh, I remember that. You
It's a
worked on
great.
that. You
It's
love
a,
that
I
project.
did. I was meant to direct it after,
Mm.
but then Orion went out of business and MGM bought all their properties and tied them up.
Yeah.
Happens. But that book was good. But it was good for the voice of the character. But I needed to build a different story than the book had.
So when you're adapting and when you say you're trying to find the greater truth, you're trying to find the greater truth in the character first and then the story arcs and the narrative once you have
After.
right after. You have to have that first.
Yeah. I mean, there's the different writers have different processes and how they develop stories, and so there's not one way to get there, but we all know when we've arrived.
Right. Yeah. I found it, really challenging to find a structure for the Looking Glass Wars when I was working on it as a movie property because of the age of the protagonist. As Alice starts at 7, and then we see her at 13, and then she's a 20-year-old. And so it takes place over 13 years, and it was a lot of territory to cover in a 2 or 2.5 hour movie. And I was never really able to separate myself from the material in a way that would do what you're talking about, was find sort of the truth of the character in the piece until you and I started talking about it as a TV show. Because as a television show, then that 13-year span and that life that Alice had both in Wonderland, then in our world, and then back in Wonderland made a lot of sense over 8 episodes. And back when you were writing movies were such a driving force, of pop culture and the place to be. Now it seems to be in television, unless you're in the Marvel universe, the DC universe. So, how much of the your teaching at NYU has switched from movie making to writing for television, and what's the difference in your approach with your students?
A good story is a good story to begin with. I was responsible for developing the TV part of the program because I'd done it in the grid. Just it was my last job, next to last job, before I went to NYU. So at the time, I was really plugged into the TV world and my experience about how to develop ideas into long form stories. I think that what the way people should develop their projects was different and different at the time that we talked about Alice's great potential and still has it as a TV series. I probably look at it differently now. Not the final product, but
Entry point.
the way to tell the story.
I was very excited after I saw the Queen's Gambit and
Yeah,
the first episode. And, it used to be
I love
that
that.
you couldn't start with the young kid and stay with the young actress or actor because the audience would get behind that person. But it was seamless, and Scott Frank did an amazing job.
Most intriguing of the writer to do limited series.
Hmm.
Because it has an end
Mm-hmm.
and it all fits together. I love series that are open ended and they go on and on. Some, they change and yeah, I watched Yellowstone and Succession and, those are fun. But really, in terms of the writer expressing himself in this media, limited series is great.
In terms of, deciding on a project, I think one of the things I remember you saying is, what's the show?
Yeah.
And when you say what's the show, what do you mean by that exactly?
What's the experience that you're meant to have?
So what are you selling? Are you selling the environment? Are you
All
selling
of it.
all of it? So when you say, okay, what's the show? You put those pieces together in your mind, and then you develop those
Yeah.
from your work process. You start
And,
with
and I think there's a document, whether it's a treatment or character or verbal pitch or, you're trying to describe, you can't go into so much detail.
mm-hmm.
But how can you describe what it is that this television series or limited series is going to deliver?
Yeah, I remember you saying to me, you're selling the environment of Victorian England and Wonderland. You're selling what happened to Alice being exiled, and then you're selling the situation that this girl finds herself in, and then you're developing the story arc of how she's going to navigate in those worlds that you've set up,
Well, you had
and
done a
the
lot of work and written
obstacles.
the story
Right.
was actually there in the novels. And the essential characters of Alice were in the novels.
Right.
And there was some expansion, I think we talked about, in the Victorian world,
Mm-hmm.
because you had two fish out of water in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That she came from Wonderland under the situation she was, the coup, and then was dropped into Victorian England. That I still feel, was a compelling character that I wanted to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you really tell that story, and I'll really begin to
Lean in.
I really want her to find herself.
Mm-hmm.
And now that she's found herself in the real world, can she go back and find herself again in the fantasy world? It's about inner creativity and, being an artist in this cruel world. But
Yeah, the imagination was also something that you landed on. That's the theme in the book, and you always encouraged me to land on that in the TV show. That thematically, it's about creativity and an imaginative person, a creative person, basically, who's being denied in a very kind of repressive place and has all this potential. And like Lewis Carroll, thematically, it's who am I? And this is her journey to find.
to juggle the internal and external
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, and find her way home.
Yeah.
So it's also got a little Wizard of Oz aspect of it. So you and I should
I think
continue to talk about
we
it.
should continue. I remember we talked at some point. Can she divide herself and exist in both worlds?
Well, that was the end of my first book.
Yeah.
And she creates a doppelganger that lives in this world to live out the life that history knows. Meanwhile, she
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
her journey in book 2 and book 3.
Yeah.
So,
And
but turns out that when Red comes to our world in the second book,
yeah.
that doppelganger is put into jeopardy, and the family that she lives with is in jeopardy.
Yeah. So, but it's still about
Yeah, it's
juggling
it's
things.
juggling the two worlds.
And sometimes you're bringing your creativity, LGBT,
Yeah.
your creativity yourself is even now as I say that, I say how topical this story is. Juggling yourself and your creative inner world and what that brings down to people in your other world.
Another thing that you often talk about is the subjective point of view and the objective point of view.
Yeah, well, it's not just me,
No, but you bring that home a lot in conversation.
I think it's you want to clarify what you're doing.
Yeah.
And if you're making a subjective movie, you're experiencing the events with the character. You don't know any more about the world than what you see through their eyes or through their experience. It'll be that technical, but basically, you're writing a story where your lead character's in every scene.
Yeah.
You can go from the subjective to the objective in the course of your story. Hitchcock does that a lot, but you can't go back.
Right. I bet you teach that often to your students.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that's a teaching thought. That's just, the teaching thing is a question of character logic and story logic.
Right.
And subjectivity and objectivity is a function of, but first, make your story make sense and make make your character make sense.
Right.
And, and you may have to dig deep for that. Not a given.
It really isn't. It was 5 years on the Looking Glass Wars because of that, digging for the character and the world creation, the logic, the rules.
The same for Hatter.
Yeah. Same for
Hatter. That was another character that did not exist in any form really in Lewis Carroll's books.
Exactly.
And it was kind of the mirror image of Alice,
And we worked on that story idea of, following Alice and following Hatter during those 13 years and having them come together.
As a team, yeah. That still sounds good on paper.
It does, yeah. A lot of things sound good on paper.
Yeah.
Translating them or pitching them or getting folks to believe in them. But I've loved working in the Alice space. I've loved working in the Alice space with you, and let's see if
you had a lot of good writers working on it. It's a big story, I would like to all the writers you had working on that. You should get in a writer's room.
Well, I did do a writer's room with Ed Decter and some folks that had worked on the graphic novels with me. So it was really fun. But things keep changing in terms of the business, in terms of the size of productions, the structure of things. As we talked about the Queen's Gambit, I think I would, might think about a little bit different approach. So, but there's more to come. So
more to come.
So once again, a very compelling conversation. When do you go back to NYU and start teaching again?
Fall.
In the fall?
It usually starts the last week of August. So.
And I heard you mentioned you're writing a novel or a couple of novels.
I am writing. Well, I have 2 novels. Yeah. So did I give one to you?
Not yet.
So I wrote one to see if I could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And
that sounds like something that I did.
And I thought it came out really good, but I wasn't. you turned me on to some agents, and there were people who wanted to get involved in the project. I thought it was done. It was a very difficult voice, dark, coming from a dark and funny place.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't, it wasn't that their ideas were good or bad. It just was, having worked all my life in the structure, in something that's collaborative,
Yes.
and expecting that I'm going to have to,
Change things.
change things and fight for my ideas, and didn't want to do it then. Did not have any desire. So as some of my colleagues read it, some of my friends read it. It's offensive.
Hmm.
I think it's funny, but it is quite offensive
Okay.
and not politically correct,
Okay. Well,
not woke.
in
But,
these days, it's probably difficult to get going, but I'd still like to read it. See
oh
what-
yeah, no, I'm not interested in it being developed exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, it was fun to write, and it's fun for me to reread. But I don't feel any like legacy need to
Yeah.
have. I wrote that as a kind of just to see if I could write prose, and so I went on to write my family story, and
Your personal family story.
my
Oh.
mother's side, yeah, as a novel.
Right.
Not as a biography.
Right.
I only know enough about it as a novel.
Right.
I don't know enough about it. But putting yourself into your mother's head, your grandparents, and trying to figure out their lives.
Yeah, some stories just need to be told for lots of personal reasons, and
Yeah, I mean,
if
it's
it
for my
finds-
daughter to read at some
Yeah.
point, my sister to read, and it's, but putting in a lot of time to getting it and having to go through this selling of editor, publisher,
Yeah.
agent. It was just as much, just as many levels. By the time I got to the end, it would be changed. That was okay with the movie because the actors and director were going to change it anyway. But the book, to go through that for no reason.
Well, generally in publishing, though, they, as the author, they make suggestions. If they want to buy the book, then they're buying you and what's there, and they're not going to force you to change things. I remember the Looking Glass Wars. They said, "Hey, these are all their suggestions," and they never forced me to make any changes. The editor made recommendations. If I didn't make those changes, then the copy editor made the same recommendation. So they had two bites at the apple, but at the end of the day, it was really up to me. Now, they were terrific, and I made tons of the changes, but unlike the movie business, you felt like it was really up to, you're the author, it's your book, you decide how you want it to be.
Yeah, but you still have to have that conversation.
Well, they have to buy into it. If they buy into it, if they don't buy it, then they're not interested because they don't expect you to do all those changes.
Yeah.
It's a completely different animal, which is why writing novels is so great if they buy into your
Well,
story.
you're more experienced in that than I have been, and far more successful. But as you've, I did bring a copy of the novel with you, so I will bring it to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Ken. It was a pleasure to.
Okay, and
do part two.
someday when I get my website up, you can point people my way,
Yes, you
and
should
then get
be.
more, and you'll come and visit me.
Yeah, well, I'll do your podcast. That's one of the important ways to grow the community.
Yeah, because I'm interested in your day-to-day process as a writer, but we'll hold that off.
Okay. I'd love to share. I'd love to be
Okay.
on the other side of this Q and A. So
Right.
thanks.